In 1974, Father Michael O'Sullivan walked into St. Bartholomew's Church in Millbrook, Massachusetts, for evening prayer and was never seen again. For 40 years, his disappearance remained the town's most haunting mystery, whispered about in grocery store aisles and discussed in hushed tones after Sunday service. The church doors were found locked from the inside, his prayer book still open on the altar, his coat hanging neatly in the vestry. But someone broke the rule of silence that had protected this small New England community for decades. St. Bartholomew's Church stood like a weathered guardian at the heart of Millbrook, Massachusetts, its Gothic spire piercing the October sky with the same determination it had shown since 1847. The red brick walls, darkened by more than a century of New England winters, held secrets that the congregation preferred to keep buried beneath layers of prayer and tradition. Father Michael O'Sullivan had served this parish for 12 years when he vanished on that crisp autumn evening of October 15, 1974. At 53, he was beloved by his parishioners, a man whose Irish accent still carried the warmth of County Cork, whose sermons spoke of redemption rather than damnation. Children would gather around him after Mass, drawn to his gentle manner and the peppermints he always carried in his cassock pockets. But Millbrook was a town that understood the weight of unspoken truths. Founded by Puritan settlers who believed that some knowledge was too dangerous for common folk, the community had learned to live with silence as a form of protection. The older residents, those whose families had walked these streets for generations, spoke in careful phrases about the church's history. They mentioned the difficult years in the 1920s, the troubles that had befallen previous clergy, the unfortunate incidents that were better left undisturbed. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who had cleaned the church for 37 years, would cross herself whenever she entered the basement where the old parish records were kept. She claimed the temperature dropped 10 degrees the moment you descended those wooden stairs, and that sometimes, just sometimes, you could hear voices speaking in languages that predated English settlement. The parish council had dismissed such tales as the imaginings of an elderly woman, but they never asked her to work alone down there again. The church itself seemed to breathe with the weight of accumulated secrets. During quiet moments, when sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows depicting the martyrdom of St. Bartholomew, congregants would sometimes report hearing footsteps in the empty nave, or catching glimpses of shadows that moved independent of any earthly source. Father O'Sullivan himself had mentioned these phenomena to his housekeeper, Mrs. Catherine Murphy, describing them not with fear but with a curious reverence, as if the building itself was trying to communicate something vital. The parish archives, stored in that perpetually cold basement, contained records dating back to the church's founding. But there were gaps, entire years missing from the leather-bound volumes, pages that had been carefully removed with surgical precision. When questioned about these omissions, the long-time parishioners would shift uncomfortably and change the subject, their eyes holding the burden of inherited knowledge they dared not share. Local historian Thomas Bradley had attempted to research the church's complete history in the early 1970s, driven by academic curiosity about the building's unique architectural features. He discovered that St. Bartholomew's had been built on land that the indigenous Massachusetts tribe had considered sacred, a place where they believed the boundary between worlds grew thin. The original Puritan settlers had chosen this location deliberately, believing they could consecrate the heathen ground through Christian worship. But Bradley's research had been abruptly halted when several of his primary sources, elderly parishioners who had agreed to interviews, suddenly refused to speak with him. His requests to examine certain church documents were denied by the parish council, and his subsequent attempts to access town records about the church were met with bureaucratic obstacles that seemed designed to discourage further investigation. He eventually abandoned the project, moving away from Millbrook within 6 months of beginning his research. The silence that surrounded St. Bartholomew's was not born of indifference, but of a collective understanding that some truths were too heavy for a small community to bear openly. It was a silence maintained by shared glances during particularly haunting sermons, by the way conversations would pause when children asked too many questions about the church's history, by the unspoken agreement that certain areas of the building were best avoided after dark. This protective quiet had served the community well for decades, allowing them to worship in peace while acknowledging, in their own careful way, that their church existed at the intersection of the known and unknowable. It was a delicate balance that required everyone's participation, a conspiracy of silence that protected both the living and the dead. Father O'Sullivan had understood this balance better than most. He had learned to navigate the unspoken rules, to offer comfort without asking too many questions, to provide spiritual guidance while respecting the boundaries that had been established long before his arrival. His parishioners trusted him because he demonstrated that faith could coexist with mystery, that some questions were better honored through reverence than answered through investigation. The evening of October 15, 1974, had begun like any other. Father O'Sullivan had celebrated the 6 p.m. weekday Mass for the usual handful of devoted parishioners, shared a quiet dinner with Mrs. Murphy, and announced his intention to spend some time in prayer before retiring. This was his custom, an hour of solitude in the church, preparing his heart and mind for the following day's responsibilities. Mrs. Murphy had watched from the rectory window as he crossed the small garden that separated his residence from the church, his silhouette disappearing through the heavy oak doors that had welcomed countless souls seeking solace. She noticed nothing unusual about his manner, no hesitation in his step, no indication that this evening would be different from hundreds of others. The church had seemed to settle into its familiar nighttime quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that spoke of prayers offered and burdens shared. The last of the autumn leaves rustled against the stained glass windows, and the old building creaked gently as it adjusted to the cooling October air. Everything appeared normal in this place where the sacred and the mysterious had learned to coexist. But in Millbrook, normal was always a fragile thing, dependent on the maintenance of ancient agreements and unspoken understandings. And that night, something would disturb the careful balance that had protected this community for generations. Detective James Morrison had been with the Massachusetts State Police for 18 years when he received the call about Father O'Sullivan's disappearance on the morning of October 16, 1974. At 42, Morrison was known for his methodical approach to investigations and his unwillingness to accept easy answers. He had worked missing persons cases before, but there was something about the circumstances surrounding the priest's vanishing that immediately struck him as extraordinary. Mrs. Catherine Murphy had discovered Father O'Sullivan missing when he failed to appear for morning Massachusetts. This was unprecedented. In 12 years of service, the priest had never missed a scheduled service without prior arrangement. When repeated knocking at the rectory door produced no response, Mrs. Murphy had used her key to enter, finding the house empty and Father O'Sullivan's bed unslept in. The church doors were locked from the inside, requiring the assistance of the parish maintenance man, George Kowalski, to gain entry through a side door that connected to the rectory. Inside, they found Father O'Sullivan's prayer book open on the altar to Psalm 139. "Search me, O God, and know my heart, test me and know my anxious thoughts." His reading glasses lay beside the book, and his evening coat hung neatly in the vestry. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of where he might have gone. Detective Morrison arrived in Millbrook with Sergeant Patricia Wells, a younger officer who specialized in missing persons investigations. From the moment they entered St. Bartholomew's, Morrison sensed an undercurrent of tension among the parishioners who had gathered. Their cooperation was polite but cautious, their answers carefully measured, as if they were walking through a minefield of potentially dangerous information. Parish Council President Harold Ashford, a stern man in his 70s whose family had helped found the church, served as the primary liaison with the police. He provided a thorough account of Father O'Sullivan's routine and character, but Morrison noticed how Ashford's responses became increasingly vague when questions touched on the church's history or any unusual incidents that might have occurred in recent months. "Father O'Sullivan was a good man," Ashford repeated multiple times during the initial interview. "He understood his place in our community. He knew how to respect the traditions that have served us well." Morrison noted the careful phrasing, the way Ashford seemed to be communicating something beyond his literal words. Mrs. Murphy provided the most detailed account of the priest's final day, but even her testimony contained curious gaps. She mentioned that Father O'Sullivan had received a phone call around 4 p.m., after which he had spent considerable time in his study with what she described as old church papers. When Morrison asked to see these documents, Mrs. Murphy led them to the study, where they found the desk cleared except for a single sheet of paper covered in what appeared to be Latin phrases written in Father O'Sullivan's careful handwriting. The Latin text, when later translated, proved to be excerpts from medieval accounts of spiritual manifestations, specifically dealing with the concept of thin places, locations where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was believed to be permeable. Among the phrases was a repeated reference to custodia silentiae, the guardianship of silence. Morrison's investigation quickly revealed that Father O'Sullivan had been in contact with the Boston Archdiocesan Archives in the weeks before his disappearance. Father Thomas Brennan, the archive keeper, confirmed that O'Sullivan had requested access to historical documents related to St. Bartholomew's founding, specifically mentioning his interest in irregularities in the early parish records. He seemed troubled by something he had discovered, Father Brennan told Morrison during a phone interview. He mentioned gaps in the church's historical record and asked about protocols for investigating unusual spiritual phenomena. I advised him to speak with his bishop before proceeding with any investigation, but he seemed to feel time was a factor. The deeper Morrison dug into Father O'Sullivan's recent activities, the more apparent it became that the priest had been conducting his own investigation into something connected to St. Bartholomew's history. Local librarian Miss Frances Whitmore revealed that Father O'Sullivan had spent several afternoons in the previous month researching newspaper archives from the 1920s, specifically looking for articles about the church. He was particularly interested in a story from 1923, Miss Whitmore recalled. Something about a previous priest who had difficulties. Father O'Sullivan seemed quite disturbed by what he found. He asked me not to mention his research to anyone, said it was a delicate matter that required careful handling. Morrison's attempts to access those same 1923 newspaper archives met with frustration. The relevant editions were missing from the library's collection, with only a note indicating they had been removed for preservation in 1974, just weeks before Father O'Sullivan's disappearance. When Morrison pressed for more information about who had authorized this removal, he encountered the same evasive responses that seemed to characterize every aspect of his investigation. Sergeant Wells, working a different angle, discovered that Father O'Sullivan had made inquiries with the diocesan office about procedures for investigating what the church termed extraordinary phenomena. He had specifically asked about protocols for dealing with locations that might be experiencing supernatural disturbances, and had requested guidance on how to properly document and report such incidents. The more Morrison learned about Father O'Sullivan's final weeks, the clearer it became that the priest had stumbled upon something that the Millbrook community had worked very hard to keep hidden. His investigation had violated an unwritten but powerful agreement that had maintained peace in the town for generations. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the church cleaning woman, proved to be a crucial witness, though her testimony came only after considerable coaxing. She revealed that Father O'Sullivan had asked her detailed questions about her experiences in the church basement, particularly about the voices she sometimes heard. More significantly, she admitted that the priest had begun spending time alone in areas of the church that were traditionally avoided by both clergy and parishioners. "He started going places he shouldn't have gone," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Places where the old priests knew better than to wander." Father O'Sullivan was a good man, but he didn't understand that some doors should stay closed, some questions shouldn't be asked. When Morrison pressed her for specifics about these forbidden areas, Mrs. Hartwell became visibly distressed and refused to continue the conversation. However, she did provide one final piece of information that would prove crucial to the investigation. Father O'Sullivan had borrowed the key to the church's oldest section, a part of the building that dated to the original 1847 construction and had been sealed off from regular use decades earlier. George Kowalski, the maintenance man, confirmed that Father O'Sullivan had indeed requested access to what parishioners called the Old Chapel, a small room behind the main altar that had been used for private prayer in the church's early years. Kowalski had reluctantly provided the key, but had warned the priest that the area was structurally unsound and potentially dangerous. "I told him it wasn't safe back there," Kowalski explained to Morrison. "The walls are old, the foundation settles funny in that section. But he said he needed to check something, said it was important church business. I should have said no, but you don't argue with a priest about church matters. As Morrison pieced together Father O'Sullivan's final investigation, a disturbing picture emerged. The priest had been systematically exploring aspects of St. Bartholomew's history that the community had agreed to leave undisturbed. He had violated not just physical boundaries by entering forbidden areas of the church, but had also broken the social contract that kept Millbrook's deepest secrets safely buried. The detective realized he was dealing with more than a simple missing person case. Father O'Sullivan's disappearance was the result of his refusal to honor the silence that protected this community, and now Morrison would have to decide whether to continue the priest's dangerous investigation or respect the boundaries that had maintained peace in Millbrook for generations. On October 17, 1974, Detective Morrison made the decision that would shatter Millbrook's carefully maintained silence forever. Armed with a search warrant and accompanied by Sergeant Wells, 2 additional state troopers, and a police photographer, he entered the sealed section of St. Bartholomew's Church that Father O'Sullivan had accessed just 2 nights before his disappearance. The old chapel behind the main altar had not been opened to regular use since 1943, when then-pastor Father Vincent Murphy, no relation to the housekeeper, had declared it unsuitable for worship and had it sealed. The official reason given to parishioners was structural instability, but parish records that Morrison had finally managed to access through a court order revealed a more troubling history. George Kowalski led the police team through a narrow corridor that connected the vestry to the old chapel, his hands shaking as he worked the heavy iron key. The air grew noticeably colder as they approached the door, and Morrison noted an unusual smell, not the mustiness he expected from a long-sealed room, but something organic and unsettling, like earth that had been recently disturbed. "Father O'Sullivan spent about an hour back here 2 nights ago," Kowalski explained as the door creaked open. "When he came out, he looked different. Pale, like he'd seen something that scared him. He didn't say much, just handed me back the key and asked me to make sure nobody else came back here without his permission." The old chapel was smaller than Morrison had expected, perhaps 12 feet by 15 feet, with stone walls that appeared to be part of the church's original 1847 construction. Dust motes danced in the flashlight beams, and their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space. But what immediately drew Morrison's attention was clear evidence that Father O'Sullivan had been working in this room, and that he had made a discovery that would explain his subsequent disappearance. Against the far wall stood a small stone altar, simpler and older than the ornate fixture in the main church. Scattered around its base were several of Father O'Sullivan's possessions, a notebook filled with his handwriting, a measuring tape, and what appeared to be archaeological tools, small brushes and trowels that seemed out of place in a house of worship. Sergeant Wells picked up the notebook while Morrison examined the altar area more closely. "Detective," she called, her voice tight with concern. "You need to hear this. Father O'Sullivan documented everything he found back here." According to the priest's meticulous notes, he had discovered evidence that the stone altar was not original to the 1847 church construction, but was significantly older, possibly predating European settlement in the area. More disturbing was his documentation of what he called structural anomalies in the wall behind the altar. Father O'Sullivan had apparently used the measuring tape to document that the chapel's back wall was nearly 3 feet thicker than the church's other interior walls. His notes indicated that when he tapped on this wall, it produced a hollow sound, suggesting the presence of a hidden space or chamber. "Day 3 of investigation," Wells read from the notebook. "The hollow sound is consistent across a 7-foot section of the wall. I can hear what sounds like settling or movement from behind the stone when the church is quiet. Mrs. Hartwell was right about the voices. They're not in the basement. They're coming from inside this wall." Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. He approached the wall that Father O'Sullivan had been investigating, running his hands along the rough stone surface. Like the priest, he could detect subtle differences in the wall's construction. Areas where the mortar appeared newer, sections where the stones didn't quite align with the overall pattern. But it was the police photographer, Officer David Chen, who made the discovery that would change everything. While setting up his equipment to document the scene, Chen noticed something unusual about the way his flash reflected off a particular section of the wall. "Detective Morrison," Chen called. "Look at this area here. The stone surface is different, smoother, like it's been worn down by contact." Morrison examined the section Chen had identified and realized they were looking at what appeared to be a hidden door or panel. The stones in this area could be moved, though it would require considerable force. Father O'Sullivan's notes indicated he had made the same discovery but had not attempted to open the concealed entrance. October 14th, final entry. Wells continued reading from the notebook. "I have found what I believe to be a sealed chamber behind the altar wall. The parish records I obtained from Boston confirm my suspicions. This church was built to contain something, not just to serve as a place of worship. The early priests knew what was back here. The community silence has been maintained for 127 years to keep this secret buried. But I cannot in good conscience leave this uninvestigated. If people have disappeared because of what lies behind this wall, I have a moral obligation to reveal the truth, regardless of the consequences to the community's peace." Morrison made the decision that Father O'Sullivan had apparently been contemplating when he vanished. With the help of the 2 state troopers, he began the careful process of moving the stones that concealed what Father O'Sullivan had identified as a hidden chamber. The work was slow and difficult, but gradually they were able to create an opening large enough for a person to enter. The smell that had been faintly present in the chapel became overwhelming as they breached the wall. Not decay, but something far older and more disturbing. Officer Chen's flashlight revealed a space that defied easy explanation. Behind the wall lay a chamber that appeared to be carved directly from the bedrock beneath the church, its dimensions far exceeding what should have been possible given the building's foundation. The walls were covered with symbols that Morrison didn't recognize. Not Christian iconography, but something that seemed to predate any European religious tradition. But it was what they found on the chamber floor that would haunt Morrison for the rest of his career. Scattered across the stone surface were personal belongings that clearly came from different time periods: a pocket watch that appeared to be from the 1920s, clothing that might have dated to the early 1900s, and more recent items including what appeared to be Father O'Sullivan's missing cassock and the small leather-bound journal he always carried. Sergeant Wells, who had crawled into the chamber to document its contents, emerged with her face pale and her hands shaking. "Detective," she said, "there are more items back there. Personal effects that look like they come from different decades. And—" She paused, clearly struggling with what she had observed. "There are marks on the walls. Like scratch marks, as if people were trying to claw their way out." The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team. What they had uncovered was evidence that Father O'Sullivan's disappearance was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that stretched back to the church's founding. The chamber appeared to be a place where people had been disappearing for more than a century, and the Millbrook community had developed its culture of silence as a way of preventing investigations that might lead to this discovery. Morrison's team spent the next 6 hours carefully documenting everything they found in the hidden chamber. The evidence suggested that at least 7 people had vanished into this space over the past century, including 3 previous priests who had served St. Bartholomew's and whose disappearances had been explained through various cover stories: transfers to other parishes, retirements, sudden departures for health reasons. But Father O'Sullivan himself was nowhere to be found, neither in the chamber nor anywhere else in the church. It was as if he had discovered this terrible secret and then simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only his belongings and his carefully documented investigation as evidence of what he had uncovered. The community's reaction to this discovery would prove that some truths are indeed too heavy for a small town to bear, and that the silence Father O'Sullivan had broken had been protecting more than just historical secrets. It had been holding back a darkness that would now be unleashed upon Millbrook forever. The news of what Detective Morrison discovered in St. Bartholomew's hidden chamber spread through Millbrook like wildfire, but not in the way anyone expected. Rather than bringing clarity or closure, the revelation shattered the community in ways that would never fully heal, creating divisions that persist to this day, 40 years after Father O'Sullivan's disappearance. Within hours of the police team's discovery, Harold Ashford and the parish council had mobilized a response that demonstrated just how deeply the community's protective silence ran. By the time Morrison attempted to bring in additional investigators and forensic specialists, he found himself facing unexpected obstacles at every turn. The Massachusetts State Police were suddenly reassigned to other cases deemed higher priority. The forensic team that had been scheduled to examine the chamber was redirected to what their superiors described as more pressing evidence. Even the court order that had granted Morrison access to the church records was somehow misplaced in the legal system, making it impossible to continue his investigation through official channels. Dr. Sarah Collins, a forensic anthropologist from Boston University who had volunteered to examine the personal effects found in the chamber, received a phone call from the university administration informing her that her involvement in the case would jeopardize her position. The items she had already begun analyzing were confiscated by federal agents who claimed jurisdiction under statutes that seemed to have been created specifically to halt the investigation. Morrison realized he was witnessing something unprecedented, a coordinated effort by multiple levels of authority to suppress evidence and prevent further investigation. Phone calls from Washington made it clear that the case was being classified under national security provisions that prohibited local law enforcement from continuing their work. The people of Millbrook have lived with this situation for over a century, Morrison was told by a federal official whose name and agency affiliation were never disclosed. They have developed effective community management strategies that maintain public safety and social stability. Outside interference would only destabilize a situation that the residents have successfully contained. But the damage to Millbrook's social fabric had already been done. The community split into factions that reflected different responses to the revelation of their town's buried secret. The Guardians, led by Harold Ashford and the traditional families, insisted that Morrison's investigation had violated sacred trusts and endangered everyone by disturbing forces that were better left undisturbed. The Seekers, a smaller group that included younger residents and several newcomers to the town, demanded full disclosure and professional investigation of what they now understood to be a century-long cover-up of multiple disappearances. They organized petition drives and contacted media outlets, trying to bring outside attention to what they described as a massive conspiracy. A third faction, the Departed, simply left Millbrook entirely. Within 6 months of Morrison's discovery, nearly 30 families had sold their homes and moved away, unwilling to continue living in a community where such secrets could be maintained for generations. The church itself became a source of deep division. Some parishioners demanded that St. Bartholomew's be deconsecrated and demolished, arguing that no Christian worship could continue in a place that had harbored such darkness. Others insisted that the church was more necessary than ever, that only continued prayer and devotion could protect the community from whatever forces the hidden chamber had contained. Father O'Sullivan was never found, despite extensive searches that extended far beyond Millbrook's borders. The official report, released 18 months after his disappearance, concluded that he had suffered a mental breakdown triggered by stress and had likely wandered away from the church in a state of confusion, possibly dying of exposure in the surrounding wilderness. But those who had access to Morrison's initial findings knew better. The evidence suggested that the chamber behind St. Bartholomew's altar was connected to something far older and more dangerous than simple criminal activity. The symbols on the walls, when finally analyzed by experts who agreed to work secretly, were identified as pre-Columbian in origin, specifically related to indigenous spiritual practices involving what ethnographers termed threshold spaces, locations where the physical world supposedly intersected with other realms of existence. Mrs. Catherine Murphy, Father O'Sullivan's housekeeper, left Millbrook within a month of the discovery and never spoke publicly about what she might have known regarding the priest's investigation. However, she did leave behind a letter, sealed and deposited with a lawyer in Boston, with instructions that it not be opened for 25 years. When that letter was finally opened in 1999, it contained a single sheet of paper with a message written in Father O'Sullivan's careful handwriting. The guardianship of silence was not meant to hide crimes, but to protect the living from truths that human minds cannot safely comprehend. Some doors should never be opened. Some questions should never be asked. I pray that those who come after me will be wiser than I was. Detective Morrison continued his career with the Massachusetts State Police, but he never again investigated a missing person case in a small New England town. Colleagues noted that he had developed what appeared to be a superstitious reluctance to disturb local traditions, even when those traditions seemed to obstruct legitimate law enforcement activities. Sergeant Wells left police work entirely within 2 years of the St. Bartholomew's investigation. She became a teacher, working with elementary school children, and when asked about her career change, she would only say that she had lost faith in the idea that all truths were worth uncovering. The hidden chamber was officially sealed by federal authorities using methods that remain classified. St. Bartholomew's Church continued to operate, but attendance never recovered to pre-1974 levels. The building was eventually sold to a private foundation that maintains it as a historical preservation site, though no historical markers indicate what was discovered there. Millbrook today is a different place than it was before Father O'Sullivan's disappearance. The comfortable silence that once protected the community has been replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that some of their neighbors know things that others do not. Trust, once the foundation of small-town life, became a rare commodity. Property values in Millbrook dropped significantly after 1974 and have never fully recovered. Young people tend to leave for college and never return. The local businesses that once thrived serving a stable community gradually closed as the population declined and the social bonds that supported local commerce weakened. Yet some aspects of the old silence persist. Newcomers to Millbrook quickly learn that certain questions about the town's history are unwelcome. Real estate agents advise potential buyers to avoid inquiring about St. Bartholomew's Church. The local library's collection of historical materials remains mysteriously incomplete. And sometimes, on quiet October evenings when the wind carries the scent of autumn leaves through the streets of Millbrook, residents report hearing what sounds like church bells, though St. Bartholomew's bell tower has been silent since 1974. Those who hear these phantom bells make no effort to investigate their source. They have learned, through bitter experience, that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The true fate of Father Michael O'Sullivan remains unknown. But his disappearance accomplished what a century of careful silence could not. It taught the people of Millbrook that the price of uncovering certain truths may be higher than any community can afford to pay. 40 years later, the question that haunts Millbrook isn't what happened to Father O'Sullivan, but whether the secrets they worked so hard to protect were worth the destruction of everything they had built to keep them hidden.